Eliza Brennan's hands trembled in the darkness of the basement, fingers white-knuckled around the crowbar as she wedged it between stones that had stood undisturbed since before she was born. The smell hit first, overwhelming her senses with its wrongness. Sweet decay mixed with something metallic that burned the back of her throat even through the dust mask. Her phone's flashlight beam caught a glint through the widening gap between the stones. Something that couldn't possibly be there, something that made her breath stop completely in her chest. Gold. Impossible amounts of it. Behind her, up the creaking wooden stairs in the shell of a house she'd bought yesterday for $1, three daughters slept in worn sleeping bags spread across the bare floor of what used to be a parlor. Outside, November, rain hammered against the condemned Victorian she couldn't afford to heat, let alone repair. The girls didn't know their mother was down here in the dark, prying secrets from walls that had kept them buried for decades. One stone came loose in her grip, surprisingly easy, as if whoever had placed it hadn't bothered with proper mortar. Another followed, then a third, revealing the hidden cavity slowly, reluctantly. Not a room exactly, but a niche carved deep into the foundation's bedrock. Metal containers filled every inch of the space. Old ammunition boxes with military latches, some stacked with precision that spoke of planning, others toppled and broken open, as if the person who'd placed them had been in a hurry, or afraid, or both. Several containers had split open entirely, their contents spilling across the cavity floor like sand from a burst bag. Even in the dim glow of her phone, there was no mistaking what she saw. Raw gold. Nuggets the size of her fist. Bars stamped with symbols she didn't recognize, tarnished but unmistakable. Flakes and dust scattered like stars against black stone. Eliza counted quickly, her mind racing even as her heart hammered. 37 containers total, more than half still sealed tight. The broken ones revealed consistent contents throughout. This wasn't jewelry or coins. This was raw wealth in a form she'd only ever seen in documentaries about mining operations and bank vaults. But the smell wasn't coming from the gold. In the corner of the cavity, shoved against the stone like an afterthought, or perhaps a warning, lay what remained of a canvas bag rotted down to scraps of leather and fabric. Something white gleamed through the decay. Bone. Human bone, unmistakable even in shadow. A skull, partially visible, eye sockets dark and empty. And next to it, still locked around what had once been wrists, a pair of handcuffs, rusty but intact after all these years. Eliza's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the basement floor. The beam spun wild before landing on rusted metal at odd angles. She stood, frozen lungs refusing to work properly, the weight of discovery crushing down on her shoulders like physical pressure. She had exactly $43 in her bank account. 3 daughters upstairs who needed breakfast in the morning. An eviction notice from 2 weeks ago that still felt like an open wound every time she thought about the sheriff's face as he'd posted it on their door. And now a fortune in what had to be stolen gold at her feet, next to a corpse that had been sealed inside this wall long enough to decay into fragments. The choice formed before conscious thought could stop it, before morality or fear or common sense could intervene. Call the police. Explain everything she'd found. Watch them take the gold as evidence while she stood there with nothing but a condemned house she couldn't afford to make livable. Or keep the secret. Take what someone else had stolen decades ago, use it to save her family from the edge of the precipice they'd been teetering on for months. The moral calculus should have been simple, should have been clear, as the difference between right and wrong. She'd spent 12 years teaching to elementary school students before budget cuts had eliminated her position. But standing there in the dark with her daughters sleeping upstairs and winter coming and no path forward except the one right in front of her, simple and clear, felt like luxuries she couldn't afford. 4 weeks earlier, a sheriff's deputy had stood on their rental house porch posting the eviction notice with mechanical efficiency while Callie watched from the doorway. 12 years old and holding a box of Clem's toys with both arms, her face showing that terrible adult resignation that no child should ever know. The kind of expression that comes from watching your mother work 2 jobs and still not make rent, from overhearing whispered phone calls with creditors late at night, from understanding in your bones that the safety you'd always taken for granted was nothing more than an illusion that could shatter at any moment. Waverly had cried silently beside her sister, 10 years old and trying so hard to be brave that it broke something in Eliza's chest. silent tears tracking down her cheeks as she clutched the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3, the one she pretended not to sleep with anymore because she was in 4th grade now, and 4th graders were supposed to be past such things. Clementine, only 7, kept asking in that small voice that children use when they already know the answer will hurt them. "Mommy, where will we sleep tonight?" As if her mother had answers, as if there was a plan beyond desperation and dwindling options, and the crushing weight of having failed to protect the people who depended on her most. Daniel's disappearance 11 months ago had started the cascade of failures. One day he was there talking about promotion opportunities at the construction company and how they should think about buying instead of renting. The next day gone, their joint account cleaned out to the tune of $52,000, leaving behind debts from underground poker games Eliza hadn't known existed. The kind of debts that came with men who knocked on doors at odd hours and made veiled threats about payment schedules. The creditors had come fast, efficient as wolves sensing weakness in the herd. The rental house went first when she couldn't make payments. Eliza's teaching position evaporated in the spring budget cuts, her 12 years of service and excellent performance reviews meaning nothing when the district needed to trim expenses. Her teaching certificate had lapsed while she'd stayed home with the girls during their early years, and now it would cost $4,200 to reinstate money that might as well have been $4 million for all the chance she had of scraping it together. She'd found work at Riverside Coffee in the mornings, pulling espresso shots and forcing smiles while her manager warned her about looking too tired, about needing to project more energy for the customers. At night, she cleaned office buildings downtown, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash while her daughters slept wherever she'd managed to beg a couch for the week. 4 weeks of borrowed spaces and overstayed welcomes. 4 weeks of watching her children's eyes grow more hollow, their shoulders more hunched, their childhood leaking away in cheap motel rooms and the backseat of their dented Honda. The classified ad in the coffee-stained newspaper had seemed like a scam. House for sale. $1 must see to believe, cash only. The kind of advertisement that screamed desperation or fraud or both. Eliza had ignored it twice, crumpled the page into recycling, fished it back out when Mrs. Henderson told her the couch was needed back by Friday, and there was nowhere else to go. 1247 Thornwood Lane stood like something from a Gothic novel gone wrong. Victorian bones from the 1890s collapsing under their own weight, and the burden of more than a century of neglect. Paint peeled in long, sad strips that curled away from the siding like dead skin. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously, boards rotted through in places that made walking across it feel like navigating a minefield. Every window was either boarded over or spiderwebbed with cracks that caught the afternoon light in jagged patterns. The yard had gone feral over the years, weeds thick as jungle underbrush reaching past Waverly's shoulders when she stepped out of the car. Clementine had whispered that it looked like a witch house pressing close against Eliza's leg, with the kind of fear that wasn't entirely pretend. Even Callie, usually so composed and careful with her words, had looked doubtful in a way that made Eliza's determination waver for a moment before hardening into something close to stubbornness. The elderly neighbor had emerged slowly from the house next door, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to trust his own joints anymore. Augustus Whitmore introduced himself with a weathered handshake. Kind eyes studying Eliza and her 3 daughters with a sort of seeing that came from decades of watching neighborhoods change and people struggle and life unfold in its endless patterns of rise and fall. His voice came out gravelly, worn smooth by 82 years of use. "You hear about the house?" Eliza's throat felt tight. "Is it really just $1? Gus leaned on his cane, taking his time with the answer in the way that old people do when they've learned that rushing rarely improves anything. "City's been trying to sell it 3 years now. Owner died with no heirs. Taxes went unpaid. They just want someone to take responsibility so they can stop mowing that jungle out front." He paused, his gaze moving over Eliza's worn jacket, the girl's shoes that didn't quite fit right anymore, the careful way Callie held herself like she was trying to take up less space in the world. "Problem is, anyone with sense knows it'll cost $50,000 just to make the place livable. And anyone with $50,000 isn't looking at dollar houses." Another pause waited with meaning. "You don't look like you're house hunting for fun." Heat rose in Eliza's cheeks, shame and defiance mixing in equal measure. "We're looking for a fresh start. Something shifted in Gus's expression, a softening around the edges that spoke of sympathy without pity. "Tell you what, City Hall closes in an hour. I'll walk you through the process. Used to work in the assessor's office before I retired, know all the paperwork inside and out." He shifted his weight, grimacing at some private pain. "But I want you to understand what you're getting into. This house will fight you every step of the way. Foundation's solid, built on bedrock, which is why it's still standing after all these years. But the roof leaks, plumbing's shot, electrical from the 1940s, probably asbestos in the walls. Basement floods every spring when the snow melts." Eliza looked at the house, then at her daughters standing beside the car with everything they owned stuffed into trash bags and cardboard boxes, then back at Gus. "What else do we have to lose?" 2 hours later, she walked out of City Hall with a deed in her hand and $43 left to her name. The clerk had smirked while processing the paperwork, making jokes about mansions and hoping she had good insurance. The transaction felt surreal in a way that made it hard to believe it was actually happening. Purchasing a house for less than a tank of gas, signing documents while city employees shuffled through dusty files and laughed about millionaire homeowners. That first night tested every ounce of Eliza's resolve and then demanded more. No electricity meant candles and a camping lantern from the dollar store, their last $20 spent on light and the fragile hope that came with it. No running water meant a neighbor's hose and buckets carried up the porch steps. No heat meant sleeping bags pulled tight against November cold that seeped through the walls and floor like the house itself was made of ice. They spread out on the living room floor, far from the walls, where Eliza could hear mice scurrying through gaps in the plaster, their scratching sounds amplified in the darkness. The candles cast dancing shadows that made the peeling wallpaper look like faces watching from the dark, judging this desperate woman who'd brought her children to sleep in a house that was barely more than a shell. Rain drummed against boarded windows, finding every weak point in the roof, leaking through in steady streams that required every pot and bucket Eliza had managed to keep after the eviction. Water pooled on the floor in corners, the sound of dripping creating a rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead felt like a countdown to some inevitable disaster. Clementine snuggled close, her small voice cutting through the sound of rain. "Are we pioneers now, Mommy? Like in the books?" Eliza pulled her youngest daughter closer, feeling the trust in that small body pressed against hers. "Something like that, baby. We're building our own adventure." Callie had been quiet all day, processing everything with that serious intensity that made her seem older than 12. Now, in the flickering candlelight, she finally spoke, her words careful and measured. "What if we can't fix it? What if it's too broken?" The question hung in the cold air, heavy with all the fears none of them had wanted to voice. Eliza looked at her oldest daughter, seeing herself reflected in those worried eyes, seeing the burden of understanding that came too early to children who'd watched their family fall apart. "Then we'll live with broken things until we can fix them. But we'll live here together as a family in our own home, a place that's ours that nobody can take away from us." The promise felt fragile as she spoke at one more thing she might not be able to deliver, but it was all she had to give. After the girls fell asleep, Eliza sat alone by the window watching rain form puddles in the overgrown yard. She'd made so many promises over the past year that had been broken. Not by choice, but broken all the same, each one adding weight to the guilt she carried like stones in her pockets. This house, this broken, leaking, freezing shell of a house, couldn't be another failure. She wouldn't let it. The vow came quietly, spoken only to herself in the darkness. "This is not our forever. I will build us something new. Not bravado, nothing so grand." Pure survival instinct compressed into words. That quiet promise in the dim glow of dollar store candles became the first step toward a future she couldn't see, but desperately needed to believe in. 3 weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and incremental progress, measured in inches rather than miles. Eliza's cousin Brandon had come through with basic plumbing repairs, calling in a favor she'd earned 2 years ago when she'd helped nurse his mother through a difficult recovery from pneumonia. His assessment had been blunt and discouraging in the way that honest people deliver bad news. The pipes were ancient, probably lead installed back when such things weren't regulated. The whole system needed replacement that would cost $8,000 minimum, even with him doing the work it cost and cutting every corner that could be safely cut. Eliza had thanked him and cried for 20 minutes after he left, sitting alone in the empty kitchen that smelled of mold and decades of accumulated neglect. Then she dried her eyes, made a list of what she could fix herself, and started working. YouTube became her teacher in those weeks. Videos on patching drywall and fixing floorboards and basic electrical work filled her phone screen late into each night after the girls were asleep. She learned to strip wire and identify load-bearing walls and mix joint compound to the right consistency. The girls helped after school, pulling nails from old boards and sorting screws while doing homework by flashlight, their young hands surprisingly capable when given clear tasks and purpose. Progress came slow but visible enough to sustain hope. Electricity working in 2 rooms. A used water heater from the salvage yard for $50 that Brandon installed in exchange for a month of home-cooked meals, his way of helping without making it feel like charity. Paint covering the worst water stains, turning walls from depressing brown to something approaching clean. Caulk filling cracks, small victories that added up to something approaching livable, if you squinted and didn't look too closely at everything still broken. Thaddeus Garrett appeared in the second week, introduced by Brandon as a friend who did carpentry and owed him a favor. Thad was 44, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work, hair going silver at the temples, hands scarred from a lifetime of using tools. He assessed the porch with professional efficiency, then started repairs without being asked, working in comfortable silence that Eliza found easier to accept than Brandon's careful sympathy. The girls warmed to him gradually over those weeks. Callie suspicious at first, watching him with the protective instincts of the oldest child who'd learned that men couldn't always be trusted. But Thad didn't push, didn't try to win her over with false friendliness. He just worked, answered her questions about construction when she asked, treated her like someone whose opinions mattered. Waverly discovered he knew local history, could identify the architectural details of their Victorian, and explain what the original builders had been trying to achieve. She peppered him with questions about the neighborhood's past, her curious mind latching onto something more interesting than their current struggles. Clementine simply showed him her drawings one afternoon, the way children do when they've decided someone is safe. He'd studied each one seriously, asked questions about her artistic choices, remembered which colors were her favorites. Eliza watched these interactions with cautious hope, recognizing the quiet competence in how he handled both repairs and her daughters. The chemistry built slowly between them. Nothing dramatic or rushed, just a growing awareness of each other that came from working side by side on shared problems. But the basement remained untouched through all of this, dark and damp, with stone walls that wept moisture and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. Eliza had bigger problems upstairs, more urgent repairs that couldn't wait. The basement could wait, until it couldn't. The smell started subtle enough to ignore just a faint wrongness in the air that the girls complained about first. Waverly thought maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow and died. Callie suggested it could be old pipes or stagnant water pooled somewhere they couldn't see. But the smell kept getting worse day by day, organic and wrong in a way that made Eliza's stomach turn whenever she got close to the basement door. Winter was approaching, fast temperatures dropping into the 30s at night. The odor was becoming unbearable, seeping up through the floorboards and into the living spaces they'd worked so hard to make habitable. Avoidance wasn't an option anymore, no matter how much Eliza dreaded facing whatever expensive problem lurked in the foundation. She descended the wooden stairs armed with her phone's flashlight, a dust mask from the hardware store, and the crowbar Gus had loaned her weeks ago for prying up old floorboards. The smell hit like a physical force, even through the mask, sweet and nauseating in a way that triggered memories from her brief time training as a nurse before she'd switched to teaching. Definitely organic, definitely decomposition of something that had been alive. The basement sprawled larger than she'd expected, running the full length of the house under spaces that didn't exist on the main floor. Stone walls, thick and old, probably original to the 1890s construction. Water stains climbed halfway up every surface, evidence of the spring flooding Gus had warned about. The dirt floor felt soft and unstable under her feet, each step sinking slightly into earth that had never been properly prepared or sealed. She followed her nose toward the far corner where the stench concentrated into something almost visible in its intensity. Her flashlight beam swept across the wall, searching for cracks where an animal might have crawled in to die. Instead, she noticed something odd about one section of stone. The mortar between them was lighter, fresher. While the rest of this basement showed more than a century of age and water damage and accumulated decay, this particular section looked like it had been repointed recently. Not this year, but maybe 20 or 30 years ago instead of 130. The smell seemed to emanate from behind this newer section of wall. Eliza ran her fingers along the mortar lines, her mind racing through possibilities shaped by too many crime shows watched late at night. People who repointed basement walls while terrible smells emerged decades later. Those stories rarely ended well with innocent explanations. Previous owners hiding something. Old septic systems improperly sealed. Maybe just a dead raccoon somehow sealed behind stones during repairs. But she couldn't leave it. Not with the smell getting worse every day and winter coming and her family living above whatever was decomposing in the dark. Eliza positioned the crowbar between two stones where the mortar looked weakest, applying pressure carefully at first, then harder when nothing gave. The first stone came loose with surprising ease, almost as if it had been placed without proper binding material at all. Someone working in a hurry, or someone who didn't know proper masonry techniques, or someone who'd planned to come back and do it right but never did. The smell rushed out in a wave that made her stumble backward, gagging despite the mask. But underneath the organic decay was something else, something metallic and sharp that made her nose burn in a completely different way. Chemical almost, or mineral wrong for decomposition. She steadied herself and loosened two more stones, creating a gap large enough to shine her light through properly. What she saw made no sense for a long moment, her brain refusing to process information that contradicted everything she understood about houses and basements and normal problems that normal people faced. Instead of dirt or a decomposing animal or even old pipes, her flashlight beam illuminated what looked like a deliberately carved cavity. Maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, chiseled straight into the bedrock behind the wall, filling every inch of that space, stacked floor to ceiling in careful rows that spoke of planning and intent, were metal containers. Old ammunition boxes, military green with latched lids and stenciled numbers, worn almost illegible with age. Some were stacked with precision that suggested someone had taken time to organize them properly. Others had toppled over and several had broken open completely. Their contents had spilled across the cavity floor like someone had dumped a treasure chest, gleaming even in the dim light of her phone. There was no mistaking what she saw, even in shadows. Gold. Raw gold in quantities that couldn't be explained by inheritance or legitimate savings. Nuggets as big as her fist, catching light in ways that costume jewelry never could. Bars stamped with symbols she didn't recognize, tarnished surfaces that spoke of decades hidden from air and light. Flakes and dust scattered like glitter across dark stone. Eliza counted quickly, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. 37 containers total, more than half still sealed tight with their military latches intact. The broken ones revealed consistent contents throughout, gold in every form imaginable, more wealth than she'd ever seen in one place, more than most people would see in a lifetime of steady work and careful saving. But the terrible smell wasn't coming from the gold. In the corner of the cavity, shoved against the stone like an afterthought, or perhaps something the person had wanted to hide even from themselves, lay what remained of a canvas bag. The fabric had rotted away to almost nothing over the years, leaving only scraps of leather and cloth that crumbled at the edges. Through the decay, Eliza could see bits of bone, unmistakably human even to her untrained eye, white fragments that caught the light. A skull, partially visible eye sockets, dark and empty and somehow accusing. And next to it, next to what had once been wrists attached to arms, attached to a person who'd breathed and lived and loved, a pair of handcuffs. Still locked after all these years, rusty but intact, the kind that police or security guards would use. In what remained of a shirt pocket, barely visible through the rot, a small photograph, water-damaged and faded but still recognizable. A young man in a security uniform, smiling, holding a baby. Eliza's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the basement floor. The beam spun wild before landing on rusted metal at an angle that made shadows leap across stone walls. She stood frozen, lungs refusing to work properly, the weight of discovery crushing down like physical pressure on her chest and shoulders. Her teaching training kicked in despite the shock. The years she'd spent studying child development and psychology before budget cuts had ended that career. The human mind cataloging information even in crisis. Handcuffs meant restraint. Restraint with a corpse meant murder, not accident. The positioning, the state of decay, the hidden cavity all pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had been killed here or killed elsewhere, and brought here sealed inside this wall to hide evidence of a crime. And the gold, the impossible amounts of gold, meant that crime had been profitable. Eliza climbed back up the basement stairs on legs that felt disconnected from her body, leaving the opening exposed behind her. She sat at her kitchen table and stared at her phone, trying to process what she'd found, trying to calculate possibilities and consequences and moral equations that didn't have clear answers. If even a few of those containers held real gold, it could be worth thousands. Tens of thousands, maybe more. Enough to fix the house properly, not just patch it together with duct tape and hope. Feed her daughters real meals instead of cereal for dinner. Get her teaching certificate reinstated. Build the life they deserved instead of the one they were barely surviving. But the larger part of her mind spun with questions that felt dangerous to even consider. Who had hidden gold in her basement wall? When was it sealed in? What about the human remains? The person who'd been handcuffed and left to become bones in the dark. Those weren't just anonymous bones. They were all that remained of someone's husband, someone's father, someone's child. A person who'd existed and mattered and whose absence had left holes in other people's lives. She thought about the house's history, the fragments she knew. Built in the 1890s, owned by the Ashford family for generations, until the last owner died earlier this year with no heirs. Gus might know more about the previous owners, about the family history, and neighborhood gossip accumulated over decades of living next door. But asking questions would mean admitting what she'd found. And if there were human remains down there, sealed behind a wall with a fortune in gold, the story attached to this discovery wouldn't be a pleasant one. People who hid rooms behind stone walls and left skeletons to guard treasure weren't usually the kind who came by their wealth honestly. The gold was stolen, had to be. And someone had died for it, or because of it, or trying to protect it. The girls came home from school in a burst of noise and energy, chattering about their day and homework and the new friends they were making at Jefferson Elementary. For the first time in months, they had an address, a school district, a place where they belonged, however tenuously. Eliza watched them spread out their homework on the salvaged kitchen table, Clem's tongue poking out in concentration as she worked through simple addition. Waverly already flying through math problems that seemed too advanced for fourth grade, Callie helping her younger sisters while keeping one eye on her mother with that sharp 12-year-old awareness that missed nothing. They had warm beds tonight, sleeping bags on actual floors instead of car seats or borrowed couches. They had a roof, however leaky, and walls, however thin. They had something that felt like home, fragile and broken, but theirs. The gold could wait one more night. The decision could wait. Everything could wait while she pretended for a few more hours that her world hadn't just turned upside down in the darkness of a basement that smelled of death and secrets. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Eliza crept back down to the basement with better lighting, her phone's camera, and a pair of rubber gloves she'd bought for cleaning. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before making any decisions. The hidden cavity looked even more surreal in the steady beam of her camping lantern, like something from a movie that couldn't possibly exist in real life. She photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting the containers and the remains and the handcuffs. Then, carefully, hands shaking inside the rubber gloves, she lifted one of the smaller pieces of spilled gold. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal feeling different from any jewelry she'd owned. Softer, somehow more malleable. Real gold felt different. She'd learned that from a documentary years ago. This felt real. Along with the bones were scraps of what? Along with the bones were scraps of what might have been clothing. A rotted leather wallet empty of any identifying information. Those handcuffs rusty but still locked around skeletal wrists. And that photograph protected somewhat by the shirt pocket, showing a young man with his whole life ahead of him, holding a baby who would grow up without a father. Eliza photographed everything, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. Whatever story this room told, she was now part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The smart thing, the right thing would be to call the police right now. Report the discovery, let authorities sort out the gold and the skeleton and all the questions that came with both. But smart and right were different things when you had 3 daughters and $43 to your name. When the difference between calling the police and keeping quiet might be the difference between your children having a future and sliding back into the desperate instability you'd just barely escaped. She resealed the opening with the loose stones, cleaning up any evidence of her intrusion with the kind of thoroughness that felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Then she climbed the stairs and spent the rest of the night researching. Gold prices fluctuated but averaged around $1,800 per ounce. Missing persons cases from the 1980s and 90s filled screen after screen when she searched. Legal implications of treasure found on private property varied by state and circumstance, but stolen property remained stolen regardless of where you found it or how long it had been hidden. She typed searches, carefully aware that internet history could be traced if anyone ever looked. 1987 missing persons. Gold theft, 1980s. Security guard disappeared, unsolved cases. Each search leading to more questions, more fragments of stories about people who'd vanished and crimes that had never been solved. And there it was, buried in newspaper archives from 37 years ago. The Cascade Mining Company heist. Nearly 200 pounds of raw gold stolen from a transport truck outside Denver. The theft itself had been audacious enough to make national news, but what made it memorable was that the security guard had disappeared that same night, presumed dead, though his body was never found. Eliza clicked through article after article, piecing together a story that made her stomach turn. The guard's name was James Hartford, 27 years old when he vanished. Wife named Rachel, daughter barely 2 years old. The investigation had focused on an employee of the transport company named William Ashford, who'd called in sick the day of the theft. Suspicious enough to draw attention, but they could never prove his involvement. The case went cold. The gold was never recovered. James Hartford's body was never found. William Ashford died in 1995 of a heart attack, apparently taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave. The timeline fit with disturbing precision. The theft happened in '87. The basement wall had been repointed sometime in the late '80s or early '90s based on the condition of the mortar, and the remains in Eliza's basement, restrained with handcuffs, suggested someone who'd been held against their will, someone who'd been silenced because of what they knew or what they'd tried to protect. Eliza found an article with a photograph of the missing security guard. James Hartford, 27 years old, in his uniform, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed his whole life was still ahead of him. The article quoted his wife saying things that broke Eliza's heart across the distance of decades. "James would never abandon us. Something terrible has happened. I know it." Staring at Hartford's photo at that young man who'd never gotten to watch his daughter grow up, Eliza felt physically ill. Those weren't just anonymous bones in her basement. They were all that remained of someone's husband, someone's father. A man who'd been murdered for doing his job, for trying to protect property that wasn't even his, for being in the wrong place when someone else's greed had turned lethal. For 3 days, Eliza wrestled with the implications while maintaining a facade of normalcy for her daughters. The ethical thing was crystalline in its clarity. Call the police, report the discovery. Let justice take its course, however delayed. The gold would become evidence in a decades-old murder investigation. Any reward for its recovery would be a fraction of its actual value if she got anything at all. And the house would still be broken, and winter would still be coming, and her daughters would still need things she couldn't provide. But ethics were a luxury when your children were wearing second-hand clothes that didn't fit and eating cereal for dinner because you couldn't afford anything else. When the choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between theoretical righteousness and your daughter's survival. When doing the right thing meant condemning your family to continue suffering for the sake of abstract principles about property and justice. On the 4th day, she made a decision that surprised even herself with its calculated boldness, its careful parsing of moral obligations into pieces she could live with. She would keep the gold, yes. Use it to build the life her daughters deserved. But she would also give James Hartford's family the closure they'd been denied for 37 years. Eliza spent hours at the library computer crafting an anonymous letter. She typed it carefully on a public terminal, clearing the history afterward, choosing every word with precision. The letter provided the exact location of the security guard's remains, enough specific details about the 1987 theft to make the tip credible, and photographs she'd taken of the skeleton and handcuffs that would give the Hartford family the answers they'd been seeking for decades. But she included nothing that showed the gold, nothing that would lead investigators to the fortune that could save her family. The photographs were carefully framed to show bones and handcuffs and evidence of murder, but not the ammunition boxes stacked behind them or the glint of gold spilled across stone. She mailed the letter from 3 towns away, using a public mailbox, far from anything that could be traced back to her. Then she went home and began the careful, exhausting process of extracting her family's new future from the basement wall, one container at a time. She worked only while the girls were at school, paranoid about being seen or interrupted. She moved the containers one at a time, each one weighing between 30 and 50 pounds, carrying them up the basement stairs through the house and loading them into her car's trunk with aching muscles and racing heart. Years of teaching had kept her in decent shape, but by the end of each day, every muscle screamed in protest. The process took 2 full weeks of careful, methodical work. She rented a storage unit under a false name in the next county over, paying cash and avoiding security cameras as much as possible. She was meticulous about leaving no trace of her activities, checking and double-checking that she hadn't dropped anything or left evidence that could connect her to what she was doing. Thad noticed her car parked oddly one afternoon when he came by to work on the porch steps. His eyes lingered on the trunk, something heavy, clearly weighing it down. Moving some old junk to donation. Eliza's heart raced, but her voice stayed steady. Just cleaning out the basement, finally. Amazing what the previous owners left behind. Thad nodded slowly, his gaze holding hers for a moment too long. That junk looks mighty heavy for old house stuff. Old tools, mostly. Metal things. You know how it accumulates. He returned to hammering, but Eliza saw calculation in his eyes. Gus had noticed, too, she was certain. The old man who'd lived next door for 50 years and witnessed everything. His window facing her driveway, his careful questions about how the house renovations were progressing when she couldn't possibly afford the improvements that were becoming visible. By the time she finished, all 37 containers of stolen gold were hidden away in the storage unit, and her basement wall looked exactly as it had when she'd bought the house. She'd even repointed the wall section with fresh mortar, then aged it using techniques from a home restoration video, making it nearly impossible to tell which stones had been disturbed. 3 days after she sealed the wall for the final time, police knocked on her door. Eliza's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs, but she invited them in with what she hoped looked like innocent confusion. She offered coffee, asked if everything was okay, projected the careful cooperation of a homeowner who had nothing to hide. Detective Marlowe Reed introduced herself with a warm handshake that seemed genuine, 48 years old with kind eyes that seemed to see too much, though something in her expression suggested compassion underneath the professional detachment. Her partner was younger 30s, probably with the careful demeanor of someone still learning the job. We received an anonymous tip about possible evidence related to an old case. We'd like permission to search your basement. Eliza forced surprise and concern to cross her face. Of course. Is everything okay? Should I be worried about something? Reed's expression softened slightly. We're just following up on information we received. May have found something related to a missing person case from many years ago. They found the resealed wall section within minutes. Eliza had made the mortar look old and weathered, but apparently not old enough to fool experts who did this for a living. They broke through the stones with efficient professionalism, working quickly and methodically, while Eliza stood at the top of the stairs with her daughters holding them close and trying to project appropriate shock and concern. The small cavity was revealed exactly as Eliza had left it, empty except for the skeleton in the corner. Handcuffs still locked around skeletal wrists, rotted canvas bags, scraps of clothing. No gold, no evidence that anything except human remains had ever occupied this space. Just bones and metal and the physical evidence of a murder committed decades ago. Reed turned to Eliza with an expression that was hard to read, professional mask firmly in place. "Mrs. Brennan, we're going to need you and your family to stay elsewhere for a few days while we process this scene. Do you have somewhere you can go?" Eliza packed bags for herself and the girls, hands only shaking slightly as she folded their clothes and gathered their things. She explained to Callie and Waverly and Clementine that the police needed to investigate something they'd found in the basement, keeping her voice calm and reassuring while her mind raced through everything that could go wrong. Callie studied her mother's face with that unnerving 12-year-old perception. "Is that why you've been acting strange since you went into the basement that first time?" Eliza's heart skipped. How much had Callie noticed? How much did she suspect? "I was just worried about the smell, about what it might cost to fix whatever was causing it. You know we're on a tight budget." Callie didn't look convinced, but she let it drop, helping Waverly pack while Eliza got Clementine ready. They stayed in a cheap motel for 4 days, while forensics teams swarmed through the basement. Eliza watched local news obsessively, jumping every time a story about their town came on, but there was nothing. Whatever the police had found, they were keeping it quiet, processing the scene without media attention or public statements that might compromise the investigation. When Reed finally called to say they could return home, Eliza drove back with her stomach in knots, wondering what came next, what questions would be asked, what suspicions had formed during those 4 days of processing evidence. Reed pulled her aside before the police vehicles left, her expression professional but not unkind. They stood in the driveway while late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard. "The remains we found appear to be those of James Hartford, a security guard who disappeared in 1987 during a major gold theft. Mr. Hartford's family has been looking for answers for 37 years. Thanks to that anonymous tip, they'll finally be able to lay him to rest and know what happened to him." Eliza forced herself to look surprised, relieved, appropriately sympathetic. "That's wonderful that his family will get closure. Do you know who killed him?" Reed's eyes never left Eliza's face. "We believe it was the previous owner of this house, William Ashford. He died in 1995, so we can't prosecute him now. But at least the family will have answers and can give James a proper burial." She paused, and the moment stretched too long, loaded with unspoken questions. "You didn't know anything about this, did you? Nothing seemed strange about the house when you bought it for that $1. Eliza gave the only honest answer she could manage. "I bought it for $1. I figured anything strange would be the least of my problems." Reed smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Fair enough." Then she added almost casually, as if commenting on the weather, "That gold was never recovered, you know. Almost 200 pounds of raw gold from that Cascade mining theft. Worth about $50 million at today's prices. Just vanished into thin air." She let that information hang in the air between them before continuing, watching Eliza's reaction carefully. "Strange that William Ashford would hide the body but not the gold, don't you think? If he was paranoid enough to wall up evidence of murder, why not secure his fortune the same way?" Eliza maintained her expression of innocent curiosity even as her pulse hammered in her ears. "I wouldn't know anything about that. I'm just glad Mr. Hartford's family will finally have answers." Reed nodded slowly, holding Eliza's gaze for one beat longer than comfortable. "Of course. Well, the case is closed as far as we're concerned. You're free to continue with your life, Mrs. Brennan. Good luck with the house renovations." As the police vehicles pulled away, Eliza watched through her front window. Reed looked back at the house one final time in her rearview mirror, her expression thoughtful and assessing in a way that sent ice down Eliza's spine. When Eliza finally shut the door and leaned against it, her heart was still pounding hard enough to hurt. The detective suspected something, that much was clear. But suspicion wasn't evidence. The case was officially closed. William Ashford was dead and couldn't be prosecuted. James Hartford's remains had been found, and his family would get the closure they deserved. And the gold, as far as the police knew, remained missing after 37 years, just as it had been before the anonymous tip arrived. For now, Eliza had bought herself time to plan her next move, time to figure out how to convert stolen gold into a legitimate future for her family without raising the red flags that would bring everything crashing down. But that night, as she tucked her daughters into their sleeping bags and kissed each of their foreheads, the weight of her decision pressed against her chest like a stone she'd swallowed that couldn't be digested. She had made her choice. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Now she had to live with it and somehow find a way to transform blood money into the life her children deserved without losing herself entirely in the process. Without becoming the kind of person who could look at a murdered man's bones and see only opportunity instead of tragedy. Without turning into William Ashford, paranoid and guilty, and dying alone with secrets that poisoned everything they touched. The compass Thad had given her sat on her nightstand, its needle still finding true north despite the interference of the house's old electrical systems. She picked it up, felt its weight in her palm, remembered his words about paths and choices and finding your way back even when you'd walked in the wrong direction. She'd walked south into darkness and deception, but maybe somehow she could still find her way back to the light. Maybe the gold could do some good after all, could redeem the crime that had brought it here, could honor James Hartford's memory by saving families instead of destroying them. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something better from the ruins. Or maybe that was just what she told herself to sleep at night. December arrived with winds that found every crack in the Victorian's facade whistling through gaps Eliza hadn't yet sealed. The furnace worked in limited capacity, concentrating heat upstairs where the girls slept, while the kitchen remained cold enough to see breath in early morning. They adjusted to layers indoors, sweaters over pajamas, blankets during homework sessions at the salvage table. Detective Reed had closed the Hartford case officially within a week of finding the remains. William Ashford identified as the killer through forensic evidence and historical investigation. Case solved, despite the perpetrator being dead for nearly 3 decades. James Hartford's body was released to his family for burial. The anonymous tipster who'd made it all possible remained unknown and untracked. But Reed's final words to Eliza lingered like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. That comment about the missing gold, the strange logic of hiding a body but not the fortune. The way her eyes had assessed Eliza's worn jacket and her daughter's outgrown shoes and the modest improvements happening to a house that should have been beyond the means of a woman working minimum wage at a coffee shop. Eliza caught herself checking mirrors while driving, scanning parking lots for unmarked vehicles, noting unfamiliar cars on Thornwood Lane. The paranoia William Ashford must have lived with for 8 years after the theft had become hers, now inherited along with his crime and his secret and the fortune he'd stolen. Gus appeared on his porch more frequently than coincidence could explain, watching as Eliza came and went at hours that didn't align with her supposed work schedule. His weathered face revealed nothing, but his presence felt like a question waiting to be asked. The storage unit sat 40 miles away, holding 37 containers of evidence that could destroy everything she was trying to build. Eliza hadn't opened it since the day she'd finished moving the gold, afraid that returning would create patterns someone might notice. The fortune existed in quantum uncertainty, simultaneously real and impossible, her salvation and her doom. Research at the Millbrook Public Library became her second home during the girls' school hours. Eliza pored over newspaper archives, on microfilm city records in dusty boxes, anything that might tell her more about William Ashford and the crime that had brought the gold to her basement. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more disturbing with each revelation. William had indeed worked for the transport company that moved the Cascade mining gold. His employment record showed 12 years of reliable service before the theft. Married young to a woman named Helen who'd died of cancer in 1983. Their daughter Margaret had been his only family, 24 years old at the time of the heist, working as a librarian in Denver. The timeline suggested William had acted alone out of desperation. Medical bills from Helen's illness had bankrupted him despite insurance. Margaret had dropped out of graduate school to help with expenses. Father and daughter struggling against debt that seemed insurmountable until opportunity and desperation collided on a highway outside Denver. But the human cost of his choice lived in other archives, Eliza discovered. Articles about James Hartford's wife Rachel and their 2-year-old daughter, the press conferences where Rachel begged for information, the slow transformation from hope to grief to resigned acceptance over years of no answers. Rachel had remarried eventually a man named David Pembroke and moved to Arizona to escape the memories Colorado held. The daughter's name was Vivian. She would be 45 now. Eliza found a recent article about a genealogist in Phoenix who specialized in helping adoptees find birth families. Vivian Hartford, the byline read, describing her work as a calling born from her own experience of loss and unanswered questions about her father. Staring at Vivian's professional photo, Eliza felt the weight of what she'd taken settle heavier on her shoulders. Not just gold, but this woman's right to have known her father, to have grown up with his voice and guidance and love. William Ashford had stolen that from her as surely as he'd stolen the gold from Cascade Mining. The first attempt at selling gold came on a Saturday morning in early December. Eliza drove 3 hours north to a coin shop in a small city she'd never visited before, bringing a single nugget the size of a marble wrapped carefully in tissue paper. The story was rehearsed until it felt almost true. Grandmother's estate, old jewelry pieces melted down years ago, curious about value. The shop owner was a thin man with thick glasses named Martin Ross, maybe 65, with the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades handling valuable things. He examined the piece under a magnifying glass, running tests with acids and electronic equipment that beeped and hummed. His entire demeanor changed when he looked up. "Where did you say you got this?" Eliza held her story steady. "Like I mentioned, it was my grandmother's, part of her estate." Ross weighed the piece on a digital scale with the precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "Ma'am, this isn't jewelry gold. This is raw gold, high purity, probably 90% or better." He set it down carefully. "This little chunk is worth about $800 at current market prices. $800 for a piece the size of a marble." Eliza's mind raced back to the storage unit, to the containers full of similar pieces, larger pieces, bars and flakes and dust. She was sitting on millions, plural, life-changing money that could solve every problem her family had ever faced. "I have some more pieces. Would you be interested in buying them?" Ross's eyes narrowed behind his thick lenses. "I'd need to see them first, and I'd need documentation of ownership. Gold like this, people ask questions about where it came from. Provenance matters, especially in these quantities." Eliza thanked him and left without selling the piece, his suspicion too obvious to risk. But she'd learned what she needed to know. The gold was real, the value staggering, and selling it would require more care than she'd anticipated. The second dealer was in Clarksville, a smaller operation in a strip mall between a laundromat and a tax preparation office. This jeweler asked fewer questions, offered $670, completed the transaction with minimal paperwork. Eliza returned home with cash that would cover groceries for a month, and a milestone she couldn't celebrate with anyone. She'd crossed another line, transforming stolen property into currency, becoming not just someone who'd found a crime scene, but someone who was actively profiting from it. The distinction felt significant in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Over the following weeks, she established a pattern. Visit different dealers in different cities, each at least 50 miles apart. Never the same place twice. Always the same story about elderly relatives and estate sales and innocent inheritance. The cash accumulated slowly but steadily in various hiding places throughout the house. Inside hollow curtain rods in the bathroom, taped beneath dresser drawers in her bedroom, sealed in plastic bags and submerged in the toilet tank, behind a loose baseboard in Callie's closet that Eliza had discovered while installing new trim. Each location carefully chosen and documented in a notebook she kept hidden in the lining of her winter coat. By Christmas, she had nearly $4,000 distributed across a dozen hiding spots. Not life-changing money yet, but enough to make the holiday special for her daughters in ways that hadn't been possible the year before. Enough to keep utilities running through winter and buy the girls clothes that actually fit instead of hand-me-downs from donation bins. Thad appeared on Christmas Eve with a small tree strapped to his truck roof and wrapped presents for each of the girls. He'd become a fixture in their lives over the months of intermittent repairs, the girls growing comfortable with his quiet presence. He brought pizza on nights Eliza worked late at the coffee shop. He taught Callie basic carpentry techniques while Waverly watched and asked questions about structural engineering. He listened to Clementine practice reading without the visible wincing most adults couldn't hide when 7-year-olds stumbled over words. By the fireplace after the girls had gone to bed, stockings hung and presents arranged under the tree. Thad handed Eliza a small box wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a vintage brass compass, its needle still finding north despite obvious age. "Belonged to my grandfather. Carried this through the trenches of France in 1918. When the path wasn't clear and artillery shook the ground until you couldn't tell up from down, this still pointed true north." He watched her expression carefully. "Thought you might need it sometimes when your path gets uncertain." Eliza ran her finger over the glass face, touched by the metaphor and the history contained in this small object. The words rose to her throat before she could stop them. "What if the path leads somewhere I shouldn't go?" Thad studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. "A good compass doesn't judge direction. It just points true north. Whether you walk that way is your choice." He paused, then added quietly, "But I've found that people who know where north is, even when they're walking south, usually find their way back eventually." The gift felt both precious and accusatory. Did Thad suspect something? Had he noticed the improvements to the house that shouldn't be possible on her salary? The new clothes for the girls. The way Eliza jumped when the phone rang. The compass hung around her neck on a chain, its weight a constant reminder that she knew which direction was right, even as she walked the opposite way. January brought heavy snow and a school closure that lasted 5 days. Trapped in the house with 3 increasingly restless daughters, Eliza focused on indoor projects to maintain the illusion of progress. She painted Clementine's bedroom a cheerful yellow that transformed the space from dingy to hopeful. She installed bookshelves in the hallway for the girls' growing library collection. She patched the last visible ceiling leaks, standing on a ladder, while Waverly held the bucket and asked questions about water damage and structural integrity. During a rare moment of solitude while the girls built an elaborate snow fort in the backyard, Eliza discovered an online forum for gold prospectors. Most were small-scale operators panning rivers or using metal detectors, but a few discussed larger finds and the logistics of monetizing them legally. She created an anonymous account and sent a carefully worded message to a username that seemed knowledgeable. Hypothetical question. If someone inherited a significant quantity of raw gold from a relative who was a prospector, what's the best way to sell it legitimately? The reply came 3 days later, direct and knowing in a way that made Eliza's stomach turn. Hypothetically, get a lawyer specializing in mineral rights, create a paper trail showing provenance, prepare to pay substantial taxes. Or meet me in Philadelphia if you want to discuss non-hypothetical solutions. Your choice which path you take. Eliza deleted the account immediately. The message had been too knowing, too direct, too much like a trap. For all she knew, the username belonged to a law enforcement officer monitoring for exactly this kind of inquiry. Reed might have closed the Hartford case officially, but that didn't mean she'd stopped looking. The paranoia William Ashford had lived with intensified daily, coloring every interaction and decision. Eliza found herself checking the street before leaving the house, varying her routes to the storage unit on the rare occasion she needed to access it, noting which neighbors were home at which hours and whether any patterns had changed. February brought the crisis that tested everything. The furnace, which had been struggling all winter to heat even the upstairs bedrooms, finally gave out completely during a brutal cold snap. Temperatures dropped into the teens, and the house became unbearable within hours. The repair estimate came back at $3,240 for parts and labor. Thad offered to do the work at cost, which would reduce the expense but still consume most of Eliza's hidden cash reserves. The financial strain ignited the first major confrontation between them. Eliza insisted she could handle the expense on her own. Thad's frustration broke through his usual calm demeanor, voice rising with each sentence. "You work minimum wage at a coffee shop, Eliza. You're supporting 3 kids in a house that needs constant repairs. The math doesn't work. Where is the money actually coming from?" "I'm managing. That's all you need to know." "Managing how? I'm not judging you. I'm worried about you. Whatever you're involved in, whatever you're hiding, it's changing you. You jump at shadows. You check over your shoulder constantly. The girls notice it too, even if they don't say anything." Heat rose in Eliza's face, defensive anger mixing with guilt. "I don't need your worry, and I don't need your charity." "It's not charity when someone cares about you." Thad stood reaching for his jacket with movements sharp and jerky. "But caring means telling the truth even when it's hard." "Is it illegal?" Whatever you're doing to get money, is it illegal? The question hung between them, direct and unavoidable. Eliza considered lying, then decided he deserved at least partial honesty. Yes, but no one is getting hurt. Not anymore. Thad absorbed this, his expression unreadable. I'll fix the furnace because it's dangerous for the girls to be in this cold. But Eliza, whatever you're involved in, be careful. Not just for your sake, for Callie and Waverly and Clem. They need their mother more than they need whatever money you think you're providing. He left without looking back, and for the next week, the silence between them expanded like ice across a lake. The girls noticed immediately, asking why Thad didn't come by anymore. Eliza offered vague explanations about him being busy with other work, but Callie's skeptical gaze said the excuse wasn't convincing anyone. Eliza missed him more than she'd expected. Not just his practical help with repairs, but his steady presence, his quiet humor, the way he treated her daughters with genuine respect rather than condescension. But bringing him closer meant risking exposure. The gold created an invisible barrier between them, a secret too dangerous to share. The furnace crisis forced Eliza's hand toward a bigger risk. She needed more cash quickly, which meant attempting a larger transaction. Instead of her cautious approach of selling small amounts to various dealers, she decided to try moving more at once. The jeweler in Philadelphia had a reputation for buying estate gold with minimal questions. Eliza selected a container with smaller nuggets and flakes that could plausibly have come from melted-down old jewelry. She loaded it into her car on a Saturday morning and told the girls she was picking up a special order for the coffee shop. The transaction in Philadelphia went disturbingly smoothly. The jeweler, an older man with a heavy Eastern European accent, examined the gold with professional detachment. He weighed it, tested purity, offered $12,000 in cash. When Eliza hesitated, concerned about carrying that much money, he smiled thinly and made an alternative suggestion. I have an associate who can wire money to account. Different name if you prefer. 20% fee. Very clean, very reliable. The offer was clearly a money laundering service, and alarm bells rang loud in Eliza's mind. He either thought she was already involved in something criminal, or he was setting her up for blackmail later. Neither option was reassuring. She declined, politely took the cash in a manila envelope, and left with her heart pounding. The jeweler's casual suggestion of illegal services meant he thought this was normal for her, that she belonged in this world of off-books transactions and false identities. She drove home with the cash hidden in a compartment under the spare tire, checking her rearview mirror obsessively for any sign of being followed. By the time she reached Millbrook, her neck and shoulders ached with tension that felt like it might never fully release. The money solved the immediate crisis. The furnace was repaired within days, heat returning to make the house livable again. But the experience reinforced just how dangerous this path was becoming. One wrong step, one untrustworthy buyer, one setup, and everything could collapse. She was walking a tightrope blindfolded while carrying her daughters on her shoulders, and the fall would destroy more than just her. March brought the first real thaw, and with it a hesitant reconciliation with Thad. He appeared one Saturday morning with lumber and supplies to rebuild the sagging front porch steps, working silently while Eliza watched from the kitchen window. When she finally went out to offer coffee, the conversation was stilted at first, then gradually warmed like spring earth after long winter. I miss having you around. The girls miss you too. Thad measured a board before responding. I miss all of you. But Eliza, I can't be part of something I don't understand. I've spent my life trying to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it would be easier to look away. I need to know you're trying to do the same. The compass hung heavy around her neck, its weight a reminder of choices and consequences. I want to tell you everything. I really do. But some things, once you know them, you can't unknow. And I won't put that burden on you. I won't make you complicit in something that could hurt you. His question came direct, unavoidable. Is it illegal? Eliza met his eyes. Yes, but I'm trying to protect my family. Everything I've done has been for them. Thad nodded slowly, then picked up his hammer and returned to the stairs. I'll fix these steps because they're dangerous and the girls need safe access. But be careful. Your daughters need you more than they need money. They rebuilt a fragile truce that day, agreeing to focus on the present and the practical needs of house and family. Thad didn't ask further questions about her finances. Eliza didn't volunteer information. But the ease of their earlier relationship had been replaced by careful distance, a mutual awareness of the secret that stood between them like a wall neither could quite scale. Late one night in mid-March, Eliza returned home from a covert trip to a dealer in another county. She'd told the girls she was working a late shift at the coffee shop, her lies becoming easier with practice in a way that disturbed her whenever she allowed herself to think about it. The house was dark, except for the kitchen light. Callie sat at the table fully dressed, despite the hour being well past 1 in the morning. Her expression held a mixture of anger and fear that made Eliza's heart drop. "Where were you without telling anyone where you were really going?" Eliza hadn't prepared an excuse for this scenario. "I needed to take care of something. Business stuff that couldn't wait." Callie's hands were clasped tight on the table, knuckles white. "In the middle of the night?" "Without saying anything, Clem woke up from a nightmare and you weren't here. I had to lie to her about where you were. I had to make up a story about you working late when I knew that wasn't true." "I'm sorry. I should have told you I was going out." Callie stood, her voice rising. "That's not the point. The point is you're hiding something." "I know you are. You're always looking over your shoulder. You jump when the phone rings. You leave at weird hours and come back smelling like fear. Thad doesn't come around anymore because of something between you two. You're scaring me, Mom." Then her daughter opened the notebook on the table, pages covered with research Eliza recognized with growing horror. Articles about William Ashford, the Cascade mining heist, James Hartford's disappearance, timeline correlations between the theft and the wall repairs in their basement. "I found the cash behind the baseboard in my closet. $2,400 in $100 bills. I've been watching you, trying to understand where the money's coming from. And then I started researching our house, the previous owners, what happened here." Callie's voice broke. "You found something in the basement, didn't you? Something more than just the body. And you kept it. You've been selling it. Whatever you're doing, it's illegal and it's changing you. And I don't know how to trust anything you say anymore." The confrontation Eliza had been dreading had arrived, delivered by her 12-year-old daughter, who was too smart and too observant to be fooled by half-truths. The kitchen felt too small, the air too thin, the weight of accumulated lies crushing down. Eliza sank into a chair, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling. "You're right. About all of it. I found something in the basement with the body, something valuable, and I kept it instead of turning it over to the police. I've been selling pieces of it to buy us food and heat and the things you need." "Gold," Callie said, her voice steady despite tears threatening. "You found the gold from the theft, the gold that security guard died protecting, the gold his family has been searching for while you've been using it to buy me new shoes." The accuracy of her daughter's deductions was both impressive and devastating. "I sent the anonymous tip about the body. I made sure his family got closure about what happened to their father. That has to count for something." Does that make us even? You gave them back a corpse while keeping millions of dollars that belonged to someone else?" Callie's hands trembled. "How am I supposed to trust you now? How do I know anything you say is true? You've been lying to me every single day for months." Eliza reached for her daughter, but Callie pulled back. "I became someone I don't recognize. I told myself it was all for you girls, to protect you and give you the life you deserve. But maybe part of it was for me, too, because I was so tired of failing, of not being able to protect you from everything that was falling apart. Maybe we'd rather have our mom back than whatever you're trying to give us." The words hit like a physical blow. Callie turned and went upstairs, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with the evidence of her daughter's investigation spread across the table. The research was thorough, the connections logical, the conclusions damning. Her 12-year-old had done detective work that rivaled what the police might do if they decided to look deeper. Eliza gathered the papers, her hands shaking. Callie knew. Not everything, but enough to destroy them all if she decided to tell someone. Enough to carry a burden no child should have to bear. The secret that had been Eliza's alone to carry had now infected her daughter, spreading like poison through the family she'd been trying so desperately to save. The next afternoon, while the girls were at school, Gus appeared at the door carrying an old envelope yellowed with age. His expression was grave in a way that made Eliza's stomach clench. "Margaret Ashford left something for me before she died. Asked me to give it to whoever bought the house after she was gone." He handed over the envelope, his weathered hands gentle with the precious cargo. Inside was a letter written in elegant script dated just weeks before Margaret's death. "To whoever finds this, my father William died in 1995. His eyes were open when I found him, terrified of something I couldn't see. I spent my entire life wondering why he was so afraid, why he drank himself to sleep most nights, why he pushed everyone away who tried to get close. If you found something in the basement, something that explains his fear and his guilt and the way he lived his last years, please know this: my father wasn't born a monster. He became one out of desperation, out of love for me, twisted into something dark by circumstances I only partially understood. His greatest fear was that I would find out what he'd done and hate him, that I would see him as the monster he believed himself to be. I never knew the truth while he was alive. Part of me is grateful for that protection. Part of me feels robbed of the chance to tell him that I loved him anyway, that I would have forgiven him if given the choice. Whatever you do with what you found, please remember, secrets can protect people from pain, but they also poison everything they touch. Choose wisely which burden you want to carry." The letter was signed simply Margaret, with a date 3 weeks before her death. Eliza read it twice, her vision blurring with tears she hadn't expected. Margaret had lived her whole life not knowing what her father had done, protected by ignorance, but also deprived of the chance to offer forgiveness or understanding. William had carried his secret alone, believing he was sparing his daughter pain, when perhaps what she'd needed most was the truth. Gus watched her carefully. "I loved Margaret from the time we were young. Asked her to marry me when we were 25. William forbade it, said I wasn't good enough for his daughter. I think he was really afraid I'd discover what he'd done, that proximity would reveal his secrets." He shifted his weight, grimacing at some old pain. "So I stayed next door for 50 years, watching over her from a distance, never telling her the truth about her father because I thought I was protecting her. But maybe I robbed her of something important, the choice to forgive or not, the chance to help him carry that burden before it killed him." His eyes met Eliza's with knowing that felt like being seen through. "Don't make my mistake. Don't think you're protecting your daughters by hiding the truth. Secrets don't protect people. They just pass the poison down to the next generation." After Gus left, Eliza sat alone with Margaret's letter and the weight of choices compounding upon choices. She'd thought keeping the gold secret would protect her daughters from the moral complexity of what she'd done. But Callie had already discovered the truth on her own, and now she carried that burden too. Waverly and Clementine would eventually figure it out as well. Children weren't as blind as parents wanted to believe. The question was whether Eliza would give them the truth willingly, or force them to discover it on their own. Each revelation, another betrayal of trust that might never be fully repaired. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Eliza was leaving the coffee shop after her shift, she noticed a car parked across the street. The same silver sedan she'd seen outside her house 3 times in the past week. As she walked to her Honda, the driver got out and approached directly. A woman, maybe early 40s, with dark hair and determined expression. Professional clothes, the kind of put-together appearance that came from careful attention to detail. She walked with purpose, no hesitation in her movements. "Mrs. Brennan, my name is Vivian Hartford. I think we need to talk about my father." The parking lot seemed to tilt sideways. Eliza's keys slipped from her fingers, clattering against asphalt. She'd known this confrontation might come eventually, but knowing didn't prepare her for the reality of standing face to face with James Hartford's daughter. Vivian didn't wait for a response. "I know what you found in that house. Not just my father's body. The gold he died protecting. All of it." Her voice was calm, controlled, but underneath ran a current of barely contained emotion. "I've been investigating since the FBI called to say they'd found his remains. Detective Reed closed the case officially, but I couldn't let it go. I needed to understand everything about what happened to my father, who killed him, where the gold went, why it took 37 years for anyone to find him. She pulled out her phone, showed Eliza a series of photographs. The storage unit Eliza had rented under a false name. The cabin she'd purchased through a shell company as a backup hiding place. Receipts from coin dealers across 3 states, her face visible in security camera footage she hadn't known existed. I hired a private investigator after the funeral. He's been watching you for months. The storage unit you rented as Sarah Chen using my first name combined with the CEO's last name. How fitting. The trips to dealers in different cities, always small amounts, always cash. The improvements to your house that don't match your income from minimum wage work. Vivian's composure cracked slightly, pain showing through the professional mask. You found my father's body and you kept the gold he died trying to protect. The gold my mother spent 40 years searching for, hoping it would lead to answers about what happened to him. Eliza glanced around the parking lot, checking for witnesses, for anyone who might overhear this conversation that could end with handcuffs. What do you want? Vivian's laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. What do I want? I want my father back. I want the 40 years we lost. I want to know what his voice sounded like when he laughed, because I was too young to remember. I want him to have walked me down the aisle at my wedding, to have met my children, to have been there for all the moments that other people take for granted. Her voice broke, tears threatening but not quite falling. But since I can't have any of that, I want you to do the right thing. Turn yourself in. Return the gold. Face the consequences for what you've done. Let there be some justice, however delayed, for what happened to my father. The demand hung between them, heavy with decades of grief and unanswered questions and pain that had shaped a life. Eliza's mind raced through options and consequences, through everything she stood to lose, and everything she'd tried so desperately to protect. I have 3 daughters who depend on me. If I go to prison, they lose their mother. They go into foster care. Their lives are destroyed for mistakes I made trying to save them. Vivian's response came swift and cutting. My father had a daughter who depended on him too, a daughter who spent her entire childhood wondering if he'd abandoned her, if she wasn't worth staying for. My mother used to find me crying in my room, asking why Daddy didn't love us enough to come home. Do you know what that does to a child? To grow up thinking your father chose to leave you? She stepped closer, voice rising. And then to finally learn the truth 37 years later, that he didn't abandon us, that he was murdered and sealed in a wall while we were out there searching, while my mother slowly broke under the weight of not knowing, while I built an entire career around helping other people find their missing family members because I couldn't find mine. The pain in Vivian's voice was raw, undisguised. Silas Blackwood murdered him for that gold. The same gold you're using to renovate your house and buy new clothes for your kids and build the life you think you deserve. You think you're different from the man who killed my father? You're not. You found stolen property next to a corpse and you took it anyway. That makes you just as guilty of profiting from his death. The comparison to William Ashford hit like a physical blow. Eliza had told herself she was different, that her circumstances justified her choices, that keeping the gold was about survival rather than greed. But standing here facing the daughter of the man whose death had made her theft possible, the moral distance she'd constructed between herself and a murderer collapsed into nothing. You're right. The admission came out quietly, each word costing something. I found the gold. I kept it. I've been selling it piece by piece for months. Everything you think about me is true. I saw that body and those handcuffs, and I understood what it meant, and I took the gold anyway. Vivian seemed surprised by the confession, her anger deflating slightly into something more complex. But I also sent the anonymous tip to the police. Eliza continued, voice strengthening as she found footing in partial truth. I made sure your father's remains were found. I gave you and your mother the closure you deserved, even though doing it put me at risk of discovery. That has to count for something. Does that make us even? You gave us back his bones while keeping millions of dollars? Vivian's hands trembled. My mother died last year. Did you know that? She spent 40 years consumed by not knowing what happened to my father. It poisoned everything. Her second marriage, her health, her ability to move forward with her life. When Detective Reed finally called to say they'd found him, I thought she'd feel relief. Peace at last. She wiped at her eyes. But she just seemed empty. Like she'd defined herself by the search for so long that finding him felt like losing him all over again. She died 3 months later. Heart attack, the doctors said. But I think it was the weight of finally knowing. The burden of carrying that truth after all those years of uncertainty. The grief in Vivian's voice made Eliza's chest ache with sympathy she had no right to feel. I'm sorry, truly sorry for everything your family went through, for everything my choices have taken from you. Sorry doesn't give me back my father. Sorry doesn't undo 40 years of pain. Vivian pulled out her phone. I'm calling Detective Reed right now. You're going to tell her everything. Where the gold is, how you found it, every sale you've made. You're going to cooperate fully with whatever investigation follows. Eliza's mind raced. Prison would mean losing her daughters to foster care. Callie and Waverly and Clementine scattered to different homes, their fragile stability shattered. Everything she'd done, every compromise and lie and theft would be for nothing. But maybe that was the point. Maybe consequences were what separated her from William Ashford, who died with his secret intact and his guilt unresolved. Maybe the only way to stop being the person she'd become was to face what she'd done and accept whatever punishment came. Wait! The word came out before she could stop it. Before you make that call, let me ask you something. What do you actually want? Not what you think you should want, but what would actually help. Would putting me in prison bring your father back? Would it undo your mother's pain? Or would it just create more suffering, more children growing up without a parent? Vivian hesitated, phone in hand. I can't give you back what was taken. I can't undo the crime or the decades of searching or your mother's pain. But I can make different choices going forward. I can use the gold to help people instead of just myself. I can try to honor your father's memory by making sure his death led to something good instead of just more pain and broken families. You're asking me to let you keep stolen gold, to profit from my father's murder. I'm asking you to let me make it right in the only way I can now, not by going to prison and destroying my family, but by building something that would make your father's death mean something, by helping other families who are where I was, desperate and drowning with no way forward. Vivian stared at her phone screen, finger hovering over the call button. The moment stretched, tension building until Eliza thought she might break under the pressure of waiting. Finally, Vivian lowered the phone. My mother wrote me a letter before she died. Told me she forgave the person who sent that anonymous tip, whoever they were. She said if someone finally found my father after all those years, maybe his death wasn't meaningless. Maybe it could lead to something good. She met Eliza's eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you. Maybe not for a long time. But I also don't want to create more pain, more children without parents. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn yourself in to Detective Reed. You're going to cooperate fully with everything she asks. And you're going to let me be part of whatever comes next. If there's any way to make this right, we're doing it together. My father's legacy isn't going to be you getting rich while hiding from consequences. Vivian made the call right there in the parking lot, Eliza standing beside her as she spoke to Reed. Detective, this is Vivian Hartford. I'm with Eliza Brennan right now. She has information about my father's case. She's ready to tell you everything. As Vivian lowered the phone, Eliza felt the weight of months of deception begin to lift, replaced by something heavier but cleaner. Terror at what came next. Relief that the lies were ending. And the strange hope that maybe somehow redemption was still possible, even for someone who'd done what she had. The avalanche had started. There was no stopping it now. The next 72 hours moved with the momentum of an avalanche. Detective Marlo Reed met them at the police station, her expression carefully neutral as she led Eliza into a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and accumulated confessions. Eliza told everything. The discovery of 37 containers next to James Hartford's remains. William Ashford's diary. Cataloging guilt and paranoia. The choice to send an anonymous tip about the body while keeping the fortune. The extraction process storage unit under a false name cabin purchased through a shell company every sale to dealers across 3 states. Reed's pen moved across her notepad recording details that would become either prosecution or immunity. When she finally turned off the recorder hours later, Eliza's throat was raw. "You understand this is serious. Multiple federal crimes. The U.S. Attorney's Office will decide whether to prosecute based on your cooperation." The recovery operation began the next morning. Federal agents accompanied Eliza to the storage unit, documenting each container as it was loaded into armored trucks. They drove to the cabin next, then back to the house where agents found cash hidden in curtain rods, drawer bottoms behind baseboards. Every hiding place exposed and emptied. Callie watched from the porch as strangers carried evidence bags from their home. That arrived as agents were finishing, taking in the scene with quick assessment. "Is this what you couldn't tell me? The illegal thing you were involved in?" Eliza met his eyes. "I found the gold months ago, kept it instead of reporting it. I've been selling it to pay for everything." He looked at the house, at the repairs they'd worked on together. "The girls. What happens if you go to prison?" "I don't know yet." His jaw tightened. "Those girls need their mother. I'll do whatever I can to help." Forensic accountants spent the next week reconstructing her transactions. The total: she'd sold $18 million, though she'd received far less in actual payment. The remaining gold, $14 million. Combined total, $32 million in stolen property. Vivian was present for much of the recovery, her expression cycling between grief and reluctant understanding. One afternoon she pulled Eliza aside. "My mother died last year. Spent 40 years consumed by not knowing what happened to my father. When Detective Reed finally called, I thought she'd feel relief. But she just seemed empty, like she'd defined herself by the search so long that finding him felt like losing him again." Vivian's voice broke. "She died 3 months later. But she wrote me a letter before she died. Said she'd forgiven whoever sent that anonymous tip. Said maybe my father's death wasn't meaningless if it led to something that protected families." 2 weeks after the confession, Eliza met Catherine Aldridge, CEO of Cascade Mining Company, in a Philadelphia office of mahogany and leather. Detective Reed was present along with Vivian and federal prosecutor Jennifer Cole. Catherine spoke first. "Cascade Mining maintains a 20% finder's fee policy. 20% of $32 million is $6.4 million. She paused. "However, you sold 40% before coming forward. Our insurance company has legal claim to reimbursement. After insurance, legal fees, and taxes, the actual fee available is $2,500,000. Prosecutor Cole opened her folder. "We're prepared to offer immunity under these conditions. You'll work as unpaid director of a community foundation for minimum 5 years. You'll design it, implement it, manage it, but draw no salary beyond minimal expenses. The $2.5 million goes into an irrevocable trust for your daughter's education. You will never personally access those funds." She slid papers across the table. "Or we prosecute. 10 to 15 years federal prison. Your daughters go into state custody. Your choice." Eliza thought of the compass pointing north even when you walked the wrong direction. "I'll accept your terms." The Hartford-Ashford Foundation came together gradually. Eliza as executive director, unpaid. Vivian providing legal oversight. Catherine representing Cascade Mining. Gus as historical advisor. Thad as construction director. Detective Reed, recently retired, as community liaison. But before the foundation launched, Eliza had to face her daughters with the full truth. She gathered them one evening, their faces reflecting different levels of understanding. She told them about the gold and the body, and the months of selling in secret. She explained about William Ashford's diary and James Hartford's daughter, and the cost her choices had imposed on people she'd never met. When she finished, silence filled the room like rising water. Callie stood, hands clenched, her voice shaking with fury. "I've known for months. I researched and investigated and figured it out because you were too busy lying to tell me the truth." Tears streamed down her 13-year-old face. "You were a criminal for 8 months. You looked me in the eye every day and lied. You made me lie to my sisters when you disappeared at night. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now?" The accusation landed like blows. Eliza had no defense that didn't sound like excuse-making. "You're right. I became someone I don't recognize. I told myself it was for you girls, but part of it was for me too, because I was tired of failing. When I found that gold, it felt like the universe giving us a break." Her voice broke. "But it was blood money from a murdered man, and I knew that. I understood exactly what it meant, and I did it anyway." Callie wiped her eyes, anger mixing with pain. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet. Maybe not for a long time, but I love you, and I don't want to lose you. So I guess we figure this out together. But don't expect me to pretend everything's okay." The news broke the following week. Community reaction divided sharply. Some praised her eventual honesty. Others called her a thief who'd profited from murder. Anonymous notes appeared in the mailbox. "Thief. Blood money. Leave Millbrook." Parents kept their children away from Callie and Waverly and Clementine as if crime was contagious. Callie bore the worst at school. One night she came home crying. "Everyone says you're a criminal. I defended you, but then I realized I don't know if you're sorry for what you did or just sorry you got caught. They're not entirely wrong. I did steal that gold. But believing in redemption is the only thing that makes this bearable. I refuse to believe we're trapped forever by our worst moments." The Foundation's first project was their own house on Thornwood Lane, completing renovations interrupted by her crimes. The transformation was both practical and symbolic. Rotted boards replaced leaking roof, repaired windows reglazed, letting light flood dark rooms. The house became proof that broken things could be restored. The second project was a bungalow on Maple Street, renovated over 6 months. When they handed keys to Jennifer Walsh, a single mother living in her car with 2 children, the moment felt triumphant and sobering. This was what the gold could become. But success didn't come easily. The third house suffered a structural collapse during renovation, costing $200,000 to repair. Critics used it as evidence Eliza was unqualified. The fourth house went to a family that seemed perfect, but 6 months later the father lost his job. Unable to afford utilities and maintenance, the house had to be reclaimed. Eliza took each failure personally, wondering if her attempt at redemption was as broken as everything else she'd touched. The Foundation's first year ended with 7 properties renovated, 6 families successfully placed. Year 2 brought expansion and refined vetting. Year 3 added partnerships with job training programs. Year 4 saw the model replicated in 2 other states. Year 5 brought them to 47 completed renovations. On a December evening, exactly 5 years after she'd bought the house for $1, the Foundation held its final dedication of the year. A modest Victorian on Oak Street, fully renovated, waiting for David Morrison and his 3 children. David was a widower whose wife had died of cancer, medical bills destroying them despite insurance. Eviction had forced them into shelters, their lives compressed into a car too small for 4 people. Eliza handed him the key and a single dollar bill. "Mr. Morrison, this is your house now. For $1 you get a chance to rebuild. What you do with that chance is up to you." David's eyes were wet. 2 years ago my wife died. The bills destroyed us. We lost everything. I was working 3 jobs and my kids barely saw me. I thought about giving up. He looked at his children. "But Mrs. Garrett called me personally. She said, 'I know exactly where you are. I've been there. Let us help.'" His voice broke. "Today my kids have a home again. They have stability. They have hope. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm building again." Inside the house, nearly 200 people crowded into rooms smelling of fresh paint. All 47 families the Foundation had helped. Vivian with her children, Catherine announcing an additional $1 million grant. Detective Reed consulting on national housing policy. Gus, 87, and frail but proud. Thad with his arm around Eliza. And the girls Callie, 17, and Stanford-bound Waverly, 15, with a math scholarship, Clementine, 12, and thriving. Later, Eliza drove alone to Millbrook Municipal Cemetery. She sat on the bench beside James Hartford's grave, snow falling gently around her. "I did it. 47 families have homes because of what happened to you, because people believed redemption was possible." Footsteps approached. Vivian appeared, wrapped against the cold. They sat together in silence. My mother's last letter said maybe my father's death wasn't meaningless if it led to something that protected families. Vivian's voice was quiet. I'm not sure I'm as generous as she was. Part of me will always be angry. But I see what you've built. I don't know if I've forgiven myself. Maybe that's the point. Maybe carrying that weight is the price of redemption. Not forgetting what we did wrong, but remembering clearly enough that we choose differently going forward. At home, Thad waited with hot chocolate. The girls watched a movie in the living room that had once been bare and freezing. The house that cost $1 now held something priceless. Eliza picked up William Ashford's diary, reading his final entry. I pray that someday the gold does some good, redeems what I've done. I don't deserve forgiveness, but maybe the money can earn it for me. She whispered, It did, William. It finally did. The compass around her neck found true north despite interference. She'd walked south into darkness for those terrible months, but she'd found her way back, brought by people who believed in second chances. Outside, snow-covered Millbrook covering the Victorian houses and the new lives being built inside them. 47 families sleeping in homes they owned for $1 and the promise to pay it forward. Redemption not earned, but offered by grace and accepted with humility. The path backward covered in failures, but the path forward built by choosing again and again to do better than yesterday demanded.